Greetings, everyone. My name is Tyler Friedman. I'm the Director of Collections, Education, and Research at the Museum of Wisconsin Art, and I'm delighted to be here tonight with Abayomi Animashaun, who will be giving a presentation entitled Rethinking Immigrant Poetry. This program is a part of the ongoing exhibition Artists Without Borders, Reflections on Art and Place, which is currently on view at MOA West Bend and MOA DTN in St. Kate the Arts Hotel. I'd like to thank the Wisconsin Humanities Council for their support of this exhibition and this programming. Professor Animashaun was born and raised in Nigeria. He received an MFA from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and his PhD from the University of Kansas. He's the author of 2 poetry collections, Sailing for Ithaca and The Giving of Pears, and he's also edited 2 anthologies. Others Will Enter the Gates, Immigrant Poets on Poetry, Influences and Writing in America, as well as Walking the Tightrope, Poetry and Prose by LGBTQ Writers from Africa. Professor Animashaun teaches at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh and lives in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So before I hand it over, just so viewers have a sense of how this will go, Professor Animashaun has about 35 to 40-minute presentation, and then we'll take questions for the remainder of the time. I would encourage you, as questions occur to you, just put them in the comment section and we'll come to them a little bit later, but no reason to hold on to them unnecessarily. So without further ado, I give you Abayomi Animashaun.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me begin by saying thank you to the Museum of Wisconsin Arts for this opportunity. I believe that such programs and initiatives as this are essential because they facilitate the kinds of conversations that make our communities more open and more diverse. Before I jump in, I'd like to say 2 things. One is that you will see me looking up at the screen and looking down. It's because I have notes here in addition to my PowerPoint. And number 2, much of what I will be saying, you will see on the PowerPoint, in the PowerPoint itself. This is because of my thick accent, and for viewers to be able to see it, it will help them better follow along with what I am talking about. So, what is American immigrant poetry? A few years ago, I was talking to a colleague of mine, a wonderful scholar. She's published books, she's won awards and all these things, involved in scholarship. And I said that I was thinking about editing an anthology about immigrant poets and immigrant poetry. And her reaction was, wait, there's such a thing as immigrant poetry? Now, this is coming from a wonderfully intelligent woman, an engaged person, a scholar in her own right, and so on and so forth. If you think that her reaction is unique, well, one of my favorite poetry references, the Princeton Handbook of Multicultural Poetries, discusses different types of poetries, but does not address or talk about American immigrant poetry. So when many people are thinking about American immigrant poetry, oftentimes it's something like this. It's either it doesn't exist. Oops, sorry about that. It's either it doesn't exist, or that it's a nebulous entity that lacks identifiable characteristics. I've tried to include this the scribble here to indicate the kind of nebulous nature when it comes to many people's discussion of immigrant poetry. What does these two reactions, what do they do, right? It's either they leave us or they leave undiscussed, they leave American immigrant poetry undiscussed or glossed over. And this contributes to a general misunderstanding of what American immigrant poetry is. So the aim of this lecture are as follows. There are 4 aims to this lecture. 1, to make the case that American immigrant poetry does exist. 2, to make the case that while complex, in many cases, there are distinct features within American immigrant poems that can help readers better understand the imagination of the immigrant poets in question. 3, to show how acknowledging that American immigrant poetry exists has the potential to help readers begin to develop comparative tools to help them evaluate immigrant poems and distinguish them from poems written by non-immigrants. And last, I'll be closing this conversation by showing how some, or at least one of my poems fits within this larger discussion. So, what is American immigrant poetry? I return to my earlier question. And my answer initially will be something of a hypothesis. For now, let's call American immigrant poetry a nexus consideration. The moment we raise the word nexus, several questions pop up. Nexus to what? Nexus between what and what? And for this issue in particular, we're looking at 2 items that American immigrant poetry is in nexus with, or 2. Namely, American immigration and American poetry. Each area of consideration requires its own lifetime of study, its own field of consideration. To be sure, many of the things that we'll be talking about today within each field, for many people, is an area of expertise. I will say a word or 2 about each because they are part of the larger conversation. I will not be going through every single dotted I and crossed T for each field of consideration. However, I want to provide something of a surface introduction that will allow us to have something of a foothold in this larger conversation. So, a word about American immigrant poetry. And here again, you're seeing this diagram showing that it's a nexus consideration between the one and the other. So, a word about American immigration. Of course, we cannot go through the full gamut of its history in a 35 minutes lecture. However, it does help to understand that the word immigrant speaks to a multitude of people from different countries with different ethnicities, stretching from our time to the very founding of this country. It helps to know, too, that many of the questions raging in our day and time about immigration is not unique to us, that much of it has been debated before in much the same language. On the one hand, you have some people saying they take our jobs. On the other hand, you have some people saying, no, they don't. Immigrants don't pay taxes. Well, they do. Immigrants don't assimilate. Nah, immigrants do assimilate. So this conversation has been going on and debated with much the same language. Also, it's important to recognize that the conversation about American immigration is largely debated between the same two broad groups, two broad camps. We're not saying everybody is the same within these camps. Of course, you have differences of opinions and so on and so forth. But on whole, for our purposes, we can say that the debate on American immigration is largely between immigration liberalists who espouse these pluralist ideologies and immigration restrictionists, many of whom espouse nativist ideologies. In addition to this, it's important to recognize that political affiliation has nothing to do with whether someone is an immigration liberalist or immigration restrictionist. For instance, one of the most liberalist policies ever passed was by Ronald Reagan, a Republican, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. On the other hand, one of the most restrictive immigration policies or laws ever passed was passed by Bill Clinton in 1996, IRERA. At the heart of this conversation, however, at its most fundamental level, are two important questions. Who are we, and who do we want to become? These core questions have played out not only in tone and rhetoric, but they also play out in policies concerning immigration, and it's been going on for over a century and a half. In terms of tone and rhetoric, we see it with the racial animus against Irish immigrants, and eventually to the Eastern and Southern Europeans in turn of century America. Also, to the onset of the first major restrictive immigration law against Chinese immigrants in 1882, renewed every 10 years and repealed in 1943. To, again, when we're talking about turn of century America, the larger conversation, what is America anyway? The hope of the world, the lamp of the world, or the dumping ground of the worst, which led to a series of restrictive laws passed between 1917 and 1929. The Emergency Quota Act, for example, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, the National Origins Act, which is a series, and the National Origins Act, H1 based respectively with the 1921 law on 3% of the population based on the 1910 census. The 1924 law takes us even further, 2% of the existing population based on the 1890 census. To the time where we come to the middle of the 20th century, where we had this wonderful, great sea change led in so many ways by JFK, an expert on American immigration, and the eventual passing of the Art-Celler Act in 1965, signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. And of course, I mentioned IRERA and the IRCA earlier. What does this tell us? It tells us that the conversation is long. It tells us that it didn't just start yesterday or with the last election cycle or the one before that. Again, this is just skimming the surface. There is no extensive conversation here. But again, this will help us better understand and appreciate the charged conversation within the field of American immigration. Now that we've said a word about American immigration, I'd like to say a word also about American poetry. And you'll see that in my conversation here, I've boiled down, I'm leaning heavily on the Princeton Handbook of Multicultural Poetries, which I absolutely love, is one of my go-to references. I'm using the categorizations, the 4 categorizations that they have when they're talking about American poetry. Given the kind of strictures that come with this 35-minute lecture, you will see that I will only be saying a word or two, a sentence or two about each period. So the 4 periods are the Colonial Period, 19th century Romanticism, Modernist poetry, and post-war, and the poems from the post-war period. So a word about each of them. In talking about the Colonial Period, let me just say this again, just a couple of sentences, and I'll reference 1 or 2 people in case members of the audience are interested and they want to take a look. A number of the poems in this period dealt with the movement from England to America. But they also dealt with the religious orthodoxies of the time while also carrying a didactic tone. One of the people that I will point to the members of our audience is Thomas Tillam in his poem from 1638, whose title is Upon the First Sight of New England. If somebody were to take up that poem and read it, the person would see all of these elements in place. Excitement about this new place. The promise, this kind of promise of a new landscape, the starting over. We'll also get this kind of didactic element and aspects of the poem that reinforce religious orthodoxies. When we're talking about 19th century American Romanticism, of course, we're talking about Emerson. We're talking about Thoreau. We're talking about the idea of returning to nature. But also, from the mid-19th century, we're also talking about Walt Whitman, whose poems spoke, and in my view, still speak distinctly to the American experiment. The modernists, on the other hand, or let me say this, reading directly from the screen, in modernist poetry, we see a radical reconsideration of previous approaches to poetry and art. We also see something of a disillusionment with the onset of and the devastation wrought by the First World War. With the modernist poets, we can think of T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, who of course wrote Tender Buttons. With the 4th period, or the 4th categorization, we have the post-war period. And we simply just mean after World War II. And again, we get this questioning, but this time there's just this kind of upspring of different approaches, questioning the normative notion of what poetry is supposed to be. We can think of the Beats, Ferlinghetti, Ginsberg, Rexroth, Gary Snyder, and others. We can think of the confessional poems of Lowell and Berryman. And somebody near and dear to my heart, John Ashbery, I didn't really take to him in my early years, but I've come to really appreciate him. John Ashbery, the conceptual poems of Buck, and so many other approaches. Some people even talk about neo-confessionalism. So many different approaches, which of course include immigrant poetry, American immigrant poetry, which of course is the argument being made in this lecture. It's against this backdrop then that American immigrant poetry exists. The American immigrant poet navigates his aesthetics and private biographical concerns within this larger conversational space informed by two fields. Before, you will see that we did not include the title or the name of this field, but now we are taking the bold step to do so. Looking at this diagram, one can see why this field of American immigrant poetry can be easily missed. There's so much conversation in each area of study that when one brings them side by side, it's almost as if they are not in conversation at all. But to have something of a formal framework of American immigrant poetry, we have to acknowledge that these two fields are in conversation. And that the field of American poetry is just as informed, maybe more so, than each individual field talked about earlier, namely American poetry and American immigration. If it's true then that American immigration does exist, if it's true what we've established here, we say, okay, we believe this. American immigrant poetry does exist. A number of questions immediately begin to surface. We're not going to go through every single one of them. However, one of those questions is, okay, what are the characteristics? What are the characteristics of American immigrant poetry? And how can they help us better understand immigrant poems? This is a very good question. And there's no way that I can go through list all, and there's no way that I can fully discuss each of those characteristics. However, I can point out some of the highlights. To get me started with this phase of this lecture, I'll be going to Anish Shivani. Right? And this is from his essay, Why I Am and Why I Am Not an Immigrant Poet. According to Shivani, the immigrant's identity as an immigrant matters to him or her, or them. The country of origin remains part of the immigrant poet's imaginary landscape, and this is important. What's also true, he says, is that there's a constant back and forth between the old country and the new country, as though one was straddling a fence. He takes this a step further. He says the immigrant poet can choose this space indefinitely and make the undecidability the basis of his, her, or their immigrant poems. Shivani takes this conversation further. But for our purposes, we'll stop with this categorization here, drawing from Shivani. I want to draw from somebody else as well. One of my absolute favorite poets, Trussell, a Polish-American poet who has a sense of tradition and whose poems clearly speak to the poetic landscape of Poland and America at the same time. She builds on what Shivani is saying by saying the following, and this is from her essay, The Contraband of Hope Ho, which is also the title of her poetry collection, her fine, fine poetry collection, The Contraband of Hope Ho. She says, again, we're building on the characteristics, in addition to the two spaces of the old and new country, she says there's a third space, an in-between space that carries elements of both the old and new, where the old and the new are in conversation with each other. Not only this third space carries a sense of transport. Bilingualism is possible here. And that because of the all, it's somewhat disorienting. This is very useful. These are important characteristics that the reader can take with them to help them better understand immigrant poetry, so that when somebody's saying immigrant poetry, they don't have this kind of, this kind of empty notion, but that there are key elements at work. The next phase of my conversation, even before I say that, let me say the following. These characteristics are not by any means exhaustive, as I mentioned earlier. There are important questions and important nuances that we have left out of this consideration. Several key considerations have been left out. However, having a sense of these characteristics do begin to move us toward a comparative framework with which we can begin to conceptualize immigrant poetry. Now, I was going to show you a few poems, but I ran into some technical difficulties. So if you don't mind, I will talk through some of the characteristics of each person mentioned here. Megan Fernandez, one of my favorite poets, just one of my absolute favorite poets. And of course, our Trussell. Now, just talk about them in passing. Megan Fernandez is someone whose poetic sensibilities are informed by two spaces. And those two spaces can readily be seen in her poems. I'll go on ahead. I took some notes here from her essay, and I'll go on ahead and provide how she identifies, which is just wonderful and interesting and moves the conversation forward in so many ways when we're talking about the immigrant poets in America. Her family are, and I'm reading directly from my notes here, African Goans, Portuguese colonized Indians that were displaced to Tanzania for 3 generations. Technically, Megan Fernandez situates our experiences and writing within the framework of diasporic living. And this is a nuanced take on the immigrant experience. What's also true is that with Fernandez, we get a sense of transport. And her poetics are informed by her penchant for surrealism and the need, her penchant for surrealism, the need to understand herself as a person in history, meaning that she has a strong sense of history, and her training in classical studies and as a pianist. If we were to take that, so in her poems, we have bilocation, In her poems, we have movement as well, the straddling of two spaces, the need to understand how she positions within those two spaces. If we move away from Fernandez for a minute and look at our Trussell, whose essay, The Contraband of Hopo, in her essay mentioned earlier, you find the poem Human Instincts there. Unlike Fernandez, transport is not surreal for Megan Fernandez. Um, Unlike Fernandez, transport is not surreal for Trussell. I mixed them up. Okay. Also, for her, transport, and by her I mean our Trussell, transport is almost tactile. We have bilocation. It has a sense of palpability to it. But also we have bilingualism. And like Fernandez, we also get a sense of history, but hers is more pronounced. What does this all mean? It means that, so the established characteristics and the poems that I just and the poets that I just discussed. So what does this all mean when we bring all these characteristics and we use them to make sense of these poets and their poems? It means that rather than deflate our understanding and appreciation of the richness of each immigrant's poem, an understanding of the characteristics discussed gives us a good foothold into each of their poems and their poetics at large. This understanding also gives us comparative tools that allow us to see how the poems and their poetics, the different approaches, begin to converge and how they start to diverge. What do these comparative tools allow us to have? Well, they allow us to have a better understanding of how each immigrant's imagination informs the established characteristics that's seen in many of their poems, the immigrants discussed, and the poems of many immigrants, whose poems, book of poems, you pick up at the bookstore. Okay, let's go back to how we began. What is American immigrant poetry? Rather than having or saying or thinking that it doesn't exist, or having this kind of nebulous idea in the back of our minds that lack identifiable characteristics, we can say the following. We can say more about our hypothesis here and move toward a working definition. We can say that the American immigrant poem or American immigrant poetry is a nexus consideration between the field of American immigration and American poetry. We can say that it has identifiable characteristics that also remain in conversation with each field, American immigration and American poetry, and that both, and it's in conversation with both at the same time. We can say it's a field composed of a multitude of practitioners from different parts of the world, whose personhoods as immigrants are daily brought into conversation with the history of this country, in particular its past and current rhetoric and policies on immigration and new arrivals. We can then say, or we can also say, that it's a field composed of a multitude of practitioners from different parts of the world, whose imaginations are brought into conversation with the aesthetics and myriad approaches to writing of the old and new country. Okay. What I would like to do then, now that we've established this and we've answered 3 of our initial main goals, I'd like to transition then to show how all of what we've talked about is operational within my own biography and my own poetics. Over time, I've come to believe that in his, her, or their daily life within the new country, the immigrant has to navigate between the rhetoric of embrace and the rhetoric of anxiety, regardless of space. For years, I tried to be more than an immigrant, by toning down my quote unquote immigrantness. I tried to silence the internal conversation within me about my identities. My daily navigation between the rhetoric of anxiety and embrace, or however, my daily navigation between the rhetoric of anxiety and embrace has brought me to a clear understanding. I understand now that regardless of how much I try, I am a Black immigrant. One who is striving to know how he fits within American history and exploring how his poems and aesthetics converge with and diverge from the long discourse on American poetry. Above all, I've come to understand that my mere presence in public will always be an occasion for both faith in the American experiment and questioning why that experiment, that American experiment, should be extended to someone like me, a Black immigrant from Africa. I have no easy answers. There are no easy answers. Only that I have to continue my lifelong exploration of who I am as an immigrant poet and other in this nation's nationality space. And if you will allow me, I'd like to close with a poem from my new poetry collection, Seahorses. It's from the first section of the book where the immigrant theme is most palpable. The poem is titled The Face You Wear. I will use the word defecate in here, and I'll use the word feces in here, as opposed to the more coarse alternative. The face you wear. It's the lowered eyes and demure smile you've learned to put on as the sole Black immigrant on the cul-de-sac. A face emptied of Lagos heat, its clutter, noise, and busy spirits. A face you know will put white neighbors at ease when you're outside mowing the lawn or raking leaves. Vacant expressions, a constant smile, a slow nod and pause that says, spit on my head. I'll wipe drool from your mouth. A face arranged to calmly look on when one neighbor deposits feces in your mailbox, a steaming pile beside your door, or when another walks over to complain again of loud immigrants with their Ebola and lice. Unlike you, this quiet immigrant with lowered eyes, who mows his lawn and rakes his yard. The kind this neighbor wouldn't mind having over for dinner. A good immigrant whose demure smile signals nothing of the old city within him, its proud people, its long history. A face put on each morning that reads, squat over me and defecate. I'll laugh with you as you're doing it. Thank you. Right. Okay. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Very powerful note to end on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that deft and theoretically trenchant talk on immigrant poetry. So now begins the Q&A section of this event. So once again, just let me encourage all of you viewers out there on Facebook and YouTube land to put your questions in the comment section. But until those come in, I'll kick things off. I'm really interested in digging a little bit more into the biographical side of things. And specifically, I wanted to ask about how you first came to poetry. I did a little bit of research on you and came across a story about you're going to a poetry reading by Derek Walcott and that being a formative moment for you. So I was hoping that you would recount that.
I was a math major I was a double major math and chemistry in my undergraduate years. Now that sounds impressive, but I wasn't very good. Half the time I didn't know what was going on. Calc 3 was a challenge. But I was studying like a good immigrant to become a scientist, an engineer, or something. I'm the first in my family, my immediate family, to go to college. So I did not have the kind of guidance and structure that some people have. So I was there just doing whatever. And then I went to this poetry reading, and Derek Walcott read the poem Love After Love. And in so many ways, I found resonance within that poem. And, the time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will arrive at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat, give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelves, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life. And that was it. Thank you. And that was it. And that was the poem. I found resonance within it. And I realized there's nothing else to do than try to be a poet, which sounds all kinds of romantic, but it's what happened.
It is very romantic. In the version of this story that I read, there was another element that I found interesting and amusing. And you had said that you fell asleep after the first poem at the reading, and then woke up for the last two, and then you heard this poem, and your life transformed, and you've never looked back.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
All right. Well, we have a question that's come in from Mary Ann. She would like to know, is the rhetoric of embracing anxiety of today's immigrant similar to what used to be called the melting pot?
No. The melting pot is this idea of, was popularized by Israel Zangwill with his play that came out in the early 20th century. And the melting pot, there's no clear indication of what it is as a descriptor. Many people have different ideas of what it is. But when I'm talking about anxiety and embrace, I'm talking about the lived experiences of the immigrant in question. Some people will embrace you. Some people would deal with you with a sense of anxiety and maybe even fall into this kind of nativist shell and ask, why, what are you doing here in my own country?
Okay. Alexandria would like to know, she says, I'd love to hear more about the process of putting Others Will Enter the Gates together.
It was that anthology. Is it okay if I hold it up?
Absolutely, please. And maybe I should mention at this point in time that we have these books in the MOA shop, so visitors can come pick them up and see the exhibition as well.
This anthology is near and dear to my heart. It's my first anthology, and it's essentially what allowed me to begin this kind of lifelong quest to better understand American immigrant poetry. In terms of process, I approached Black Lawrence Press. They're my publisher. I approached them about this idea, and they were enthusiastic about it. And I then went around asking poets whose work I love to see if they would want to contribute. Rigoberto Gonzalez, for instance, Edward Trussell. And during the process, we put out a call for submissions. So I was hunting around, but we also had this call for submissions, and I got gems, and I got to meet people that I would otherwise not know. Someone like Megan Fernandez, who has become one of my favorite poets in this country. It was a joy putting it together. I grew so much. And the book allowed me to better understand who I am and embrace myself.
Excellent. To get back to your biography, this formative undergraduate experience with the Derek Walcott reading, did that take place in the United States, or was that?
Yes.
Okay.
Very much so. In Indiana.
In Indiana, okay. So you had essentially little to no relationship with poetry when you were in Nigeria.
No, I did not.
Interesting. I guess my question then is, to what extent has coming to poetry and immersing yourself, your whole being in poetry, has that influenced the way that you think about your life before poetry, your life in Nigeria, or is it more present and forward-looking?
Oh, I love this question. Poetry has helped me better embrace Nigeria. That's not to say that I could not become a poet in Nigeria. There are many wonderful people who become poets in Nigeria. My journey is just that. My journey, I discovered poetry here, and poetry is allowing me to better understand who I am. Whatever questions I have, poetry about my identities, poetry is allowing me to explore them. Whatever affects I had or I may have, poetry is allowing me to deal with them by humbling me daily, because poetry is the great teacher. There is no end to it, and you'll never know everything. So this journey in poetry has allowed me to better embrace Nigeria, in particular the city where I grew up, Lagos. And there's a whole section of Lagos. I mentioned Lagos in the poem that I just read, but there's a whole section of poems in my first collection that deal with Lagos and that celebrates Lagos and my journey away from it, and maybe even my journey back to it.
Beautiful. This question is somewhat related, I think. How has American immigrant poetry influenced your own cultural identity?
So I'll do my best to answer this question by saying that the immigrant imagination is rich. The immigrant imagination allows for a multitude of approaches. It allows you to be able to take on the biographical. It allows you to also take on whatever it is that fancies you. So all those options are available to you. And what you will find is that the immigrant poet doesn't only write about one thing, the immigrant poet writes about multiple things. For me, like I said earlier, it allows me to be able to fully and honestly embrace who I am as a Black person, as a Black immigrant, and a Black immigrant from West Africa of a particular tribe, the Yoruba. And those elements enter my poems as well. So I mentioned earlier about poems within the first section of the Giving of Pairs. You will find in those poems moments where I become bilingual. You'll find moments when I also practice bilocation, kind of like what we talked about earlier.
Okay. Another question. Marianne would like to know whether the children or the grandchildren, or I gather even more distant descendants of European immigrants would also be considered immigrant poets. So I guess this question could also be maybe expanded to ask about generations of immigrants that are a little bit further from the person immigrating from one country to another. To what extent does the nature of immigrant poetry shift as the chain grows longer?
So not everybody can identify as an immigrant. At some point, we have to understand that the immigrant has to contend with the reality of being marginalized from the mainstream, right? For white people, for people who identify as whites, they have whiteness to help them. Their children have whiteness to help them enter the mainstream. I do not, right? I do not. Now, that's not to say that white people cannot identify as immigrants. What's true is that Ewa Trussell is white. She's Polish. What's true is that she faces some of the barriers that many immigrants face. Linguistic differences, the need to navigate this nationality space, the potential of being met, and because of her accent, being looked down upon as unintelligent. When these elements have faded away, it is hard for the person who now enjoys the mainstream to now say that they identify with the challenges of being an immigrant. That's one answer. So, as Anis Chigani said, the immigrant is a person for whom his immigrantness matters to him or her or them. A Canadian immigrant may not even, who is white, may not identify as an immigrant at all. However, a Polish immigrant who is also white with an accent, who is new to this country, doesn't understand the landscape, will have vastly different experience. The conversation is long, it's involved, but I think that might provide something of a handle to help us navigate those nuances, and there are nuances.
I agree. Well, it looks like we're coming to the end of our time, but before we go, I would like to ask if you have any final thoughts or final topics to address, or maybe a final poem to read.
Okay, I can read a poem.
That'd be great.
I'll read a poem from my first collection. We talked about informing, how poetry informs how I relate to my old country. I'm paraphrasing here. One of my big influences is the modern Greek poet Constantine Cavafy. And his poem Ithaca is a very famous poem. So I took that poem and I stripped it and I tried to tailor it to my own experience about leaving Lagos. So the title of this poem is called Leaving Lagos, and it's after Cavafy. As you set out to leave Lagos, wish that the way be long, full of adventure, full of knowledge. Wish that the way be long, and for mornings filled with such joy as when you enter the ports the first time. Always keep Lagos in your mind, but do not hurry the journey. Better if it lasts many years. If now you find her poor, Lagos did not betray you. Without her, you would not have set out at all. And if you find yourself in that country an old man, remember Lagos gave you the beautiful journey. She has no more to give you. By then, with all your wisdom, all your experience, and rich with all you would have gained along the way, you will understand what Lagos means.
I don't know what I can add, and that's a beautiful note to end on. So I'll simply say thank you so much, Abayomi, for giving this talk. Very much appreciated. And I hope that everyone who has not seen the exhibition will make it down to see the exhibition. We'll pick up Abayomi's books in the gift shop, and we'll have new fodder for thinking about immigration, identity, culture between the two.
Thank you.